Warning, page 341. Because people are so complacently gullible, the regime's intentions dawned on them slowly. The regime was simply not strong enough yet to eradicate all the unwanted at once. So for the time being, they were uprooted, not from life itself, but from the memory of their fellows. What made it all the easier to reestablish the Exile system was that the old transportation roads had not become blocked or fallen in, while the places of exile in Siberia, around Archangel, around Vologda, had not changed in the slightest and were not a bit surprised. Nor would statesmen-like thought stop here, stop there. Someone's finger would slide over a map of a sixth part of the Earth's land surface and spacious Kazakhstan. The moment it adhered to the Union of Republics, would fit neatly into the Exile system with its great expanses, while even in Siberia itself, many suitably godforsaken places awaited discovery. There was, however, in the Exile system, one residual snag: the parasitical attitude of the exiles, who thought the state had an obligation to feed them. The Tsar's government did not dare to try compelling the exiles to increase the national product, and professional revolutionaries considered it beneath them to work in Yakutia. An exile settler had the right to 15 desiatins of land, 65 times as much as a kolkhatnik now. Remember, when you add that nick onto the end of this word, kolkhoz, I guess it's the area, and nick, that means a person of. Whenever you see nick, they're speaking of, like the way you say a suburbanite, maybe. If the revolutionaries did not fling themselves into the task of cultivation, the Yakuts were very attached to the land and bought them off, leasing the land and paying with produce and the use of horses. Thus the revolutionary arrived with empty hands and immediately became a creditor of the Yakuts. Apart from this, the Tsarist government paid its exiled political enemy 12 rubles a month subsistence money and 22 rubles a year clothing money. Lepashinsky writes that Lenin too received and did not refuse the 12 rubles a month, while Lepashinsky himself got 16 rubles because he was not just an exile, but an exiled civil servant. F. Khan now assures us that this money was very much too little, but we know the prices in Siberia were 1/2 or 1/3 of those in Russia. And so the state's maintenance allowance for exiles was in fact overgenerous. It enabled Lenin, for instance, to spend 3 whole years comfortably studying the theory of revolution, not worrying at all about the source of his livelihood. Martel writes that he paid his landlord 5 rubles a month for accommodation with full board and spent the rest on books or put it aside for his escape. The anarchist A.P. Ulanovsky says that in exile in the Turkestan region, where he was with Stalin, he had money to spare for the first time in his life. He used to send part of it to a free girl whom he had met somewhere on the way, and could afford to sample cocoa for the first time. Elk meat and sturgeon could be had for nothing out there, and a good solid house cost 12 rubles, 1 month's subsistence money. None of the politicals wanted anything, and all administrative exiles received a money allowance. None of the politicals wanted for anything, and were all well clad. They arrived in warm clothes. True exiles settled for life. The Butoviki of Soviet times did not receive a cash allowance, but sheepskin coats. All their clothing and boots came to them gratis from public funds. Gift. Chekhov established that on Sakhalin, settlers received their basic needs from the state in kind, without payment, the men for 2 or 3 years, the women for the whole period of their sentence, and that included 40 zolotniks, i.e. 200 grams of meat a day, and 3 pounds, i.e. a kilo 200, of bakery bread, as much as the Tikhanovites in our Vorkuta mines got for producing 50% above the norm. True, Chekhov finds that the bread is made from poor flour and underbaked, but it's no better in the camps. They were issued with 1 sheepskin coat, a cloth coat, and several pairs of boots. Another of the Tsar's government's practices was to pay the exiles deliberately inflated prices for their wages to encourage them to produce. Chekhov came to the conclusion that instead of the colony, Sakhalin, bringing Russia any profit, Russia fed the colony, its colony. Needless to say, our Soviet political exile system could not rest on such unsound foundations. In 1928, the Second All-Russian Congress of Administrative Workers recognized that the existing system was unsatisfactory and petitioned for the organization of places of exile in the form of colonies in remote and isolated localities, and also the introduction of a system of unspecified, indefinite sentences. From 1929, they started elaborating a system of exile in conjunction with forced labor. He that does not work shall not eat, and it's a socialist principle, and the Soviet exile system could only be constructed on the basis of this socialist principle. But socialists were just people who were used to receiving their food without payment in exile. Because the Soviet government did not dare to break this tradition immediately, its treasury also began paying political exiles, only of course not all of them, not the counter-revolutionaries, but the socialist pullets, making some gradations among them. For instance, in Chimkent in 1927, socialist revolutionaries and SDs, social democrats, were given 6 rubles a month, and Trotskyites 30. They were still comrades after all, still Bolsheviks. Only these were no longer Tsarist rubles. The rent for the smallest room was 10 rubles a month, and 20 kopecks a day bought only meager fare. As time went by, things were harder. By 1933, they were paying the Polits a grant of 6 rubles, 25 a month. But in that year, as I myself very well remember, a kilogram of half-baked commercial rye bread off the ration cost 3 rubles. There was one thing left for the socialists: not language teaching, not writing theoretical works, but back-breaking work. Excuse me. From those who did go to work, the GPU immediately took away whatever miserable allowance they were still receiving. However, even if they were willing to work, it was not so easy for exiles to earn a wage. The end of the 20s is of course memorable as a period of high unemployment in our country. Getting a job was a prerogative of persons with unblemished records and trade union cards, and exiles could not compete by exhibiting their education and experience. They also had the local police headquarters hanging menacingly over them. Without its permission, no employer would ever dare take on an exile. Even a former exile had little hope of a good job. The brand in his passport was an impediment. In Kazan, in 1934, SPS remembers a group of educated exiles in desperation hired themselves out as roadmakers. They were rebuked by police headquarters. What was the meaning of this demonstration? No one offered to help them find other work, and Grigory B. paid the security officer in his own coin. Have you got a nice little trial coming up? We could sign on as paid witnesses. Haven't you? They had to count every crumb twice. This was what the Russian political exile system had come to. No time left for debate or for writing protests against the credo. One worrying they were free from was how to cope with senseless idleness. Their one concern now was how to avoid dying of hunger, and how not to let themselves down by becoming stoolies. In the first Soviet years, in a land freed at last from age-old slavery, the pride and independence of political exile sagged like a punctured balloon. It turned out that the strength which the previous regime had uneasily acknowledged in political prisoners was imaginary. What had created and maintained that strength was only public opinion in the country. Once public opinion was supplanted by organized opinion, the exiles, with their protests and their rights, were helplessly subjected to the tyranny of stupid, flustered GPU men and inhuman secret instructions. Dzerzhinsky lived long enough to set his hand to the first of these instructions. A single hoarse cry, one strangled word to remind the free of your existence, was now impossible. If an exiled worker sent a letter to his old factory, the worker who read it out, as Vasily Kirillovich Yugoshin did in Leningrad, was immediately exiled himself. Exiles now lost not only monetary allowances, the means of existence, but all rights whatsoever. The GPU could get at them to prolong their banishment, arrest them or transport them even more easily than when they were supposed to be free, uninhibited, treat them like rubber dolls rather than people. Nothing was easier than to shake them up by means such as those once used in Chimkent. It was announced that the exile colony was to be wound up within 24 hours. In 24 hours, the exiles had to hand over any business in which they were engaged, pull down their houses, get rid of their household goods, make their preparations for the journey, and set off by a prescribed route. It was not much easier than being a transported prisoner, nor was the exile's future much more certain. But forgetting for a moment the silence of the public and the heavy pressures of the GPU, what were the exiles themselves like? These party members, so-called without parties. I am not thinking of the cadets. There were no cadets left. They had all been done to death. But asking what it meant by 1927 or 1930 to be nominally a socialist revolutionary or a Menshevik. Nowhere in the country were there any active groups corresponding to these names. For a long time now, ever since the revolution, in 10 storm-fraught years, their programs had not been re-examined. and even if these parties had suddenly risen from the dead, nobody knew how they would interpret all that happened and what they would propose. For a long time now, the whole press had mentioned them only in the past tense, and surviving members lived with their families, worked at their jobs, and thought no more about their parties. But names once inscribed in the tablets of the GPU are indelible. At a sudden nocturnal signal, these scattered rabbits were plucked from their burrows and transported via transit jails to, for instance, Bukhara. Thus, I.V. Stolyarov arrived there in 1930 to meet aging socialist revolutionaries and social democrats gathered in from all corners of the country. Rudely snatched from the lives they were used to, they had nothing better to do than begin arguing and assessing the current political situation and speculating what course history would have taken if only, and if only. So, their enemies knocked together from them, not, of course, a political party, but a target for sinking. Exiles of the 20s recall that the only live and militant party at the time was the Zionist Socialist Party, with its vigorous youth organization, Hashmer, and its legal Kehalutz organization, which existed to establish Jewish agrarian communes in the Crimea. In 1926, the whole Central Committee was jailed, and in 1927, indomitantly, cheerful boys and girls 15, 16, and under were taken from the Crimea and exiled. They were sent to Turtkul and other strict places. This really was a party, a close-knit, determined, sure that its cause was just. Their aim, however, was one which all could share, but private in particular, to live as a nation in a Palestine of their own. The Communist Party, which had voluntarily disowned its fatherland, could not tolerate narrow nationalism in others. Mutual aid was still practiced among the exiles until the beginning of the 30s. The Socialist Revolutionaries, Social Democrats, and anarchist exiles in Chimkent, where work was easy to find, set up a secret mutual aid fund to help their work with Northern Party comrades. Communal arrangements for the preparation of food and the care of children, and all the gatherings and exchanges of visits which naturally go with this, were still found in places. They still joined together to celebrate May Day, there in exile, while demonstratively refusing to observe the anniversary of the October Revolution. But as the 30s reached their climax, all this would disappear. Everywhere the buzzard's eye had the secret police would fix on exiles meeting in groups. Prisoners would begin to shun one another in case the NKVD suspected them of organizing and picking them up on a new charge. This fate awaited them anyhow. Thus, in the pale of exile, marked out by the state, they would withdraw into second voluntary exile, into solitude. For the present, would be just what Stalin wanted of them. The exiles were further weakened by the estrangement of the local population. The local people were persecuted for showing friendship to exiles. Offenders were themselves exiled to other places, and youngsters expelled from the Komsomol. They were still further weakened by the unfriendly relations between the parties which developed in the Soviet period and became particularly acute from the mid-20s, when large numbers of Trotskyites who acknowledged no one but themselves as politicals suddenly appeared in exile. But it was, of course, not only socialists who were kept in exile in the 20s. Most of the exiles, in fact, and this was truer with every year that passed, were not socialists at all. There was an influx of non-party intellectuals, those spiritually independent people who were making it difficult for the regime to establish itself firmly, and former people, i.e. members of the pre-revolutionary establishment, not destroyed in the Civil War, and even of young boys for foxtrotting, and spiritualists and occultists and clerics, at first with the right to conduct services in exile, and simply believers, simply Christians, or Christiania, peasants, who used the word as modified by the Russians many centuries ago. They all came under the eye of the same security police sector, were divided from each other, and grew numb. Robbed of all strength by the indifference of the country at large, the exiles lost even the will to escape. For 1,000 Tsar's times, escaping was a merry sport. Think of Stalin's 5 and Ilgin's 6 escapes. The threat hanging over them was not a bullet, not katorga, but merely being resettled in their old place of exile after a diverting journey. But the NVD, as it grew more stupid and heavy-handed from the mid-20s, imposed collective responsibility on exiles belonging to the same party. If one of you runs away, all his party comrades will answer for him. By now the air was so stifling, the pressure so overbearing, that the socialists, so recently proud and indomitable, accepted this responsibility. They themselves, in party resolutions, forbade themselves to escape. Well, where, in any case, could they run to? To whom could they run? Was there people to whom they might run? Specialists and theoretical rationalization deftly put foundations under the decision. This is not the right time to run away. We must wait. In fact, it was not the right time to fight at all. Again, they must wait. At the beginning of the 30s, N.Y. Mandelstam noted that socialist exiles in Cherdynsk utterly refused to resist, even when they sensed that their destruction was inevitable. The only practical hope was an extension of their term of banishment, so long as they were not arrested and were allowed to sign on again there, on the spot. Then at least their modestly comfortable existence would not be ruined. Their only moral aim was to preserve their human dignity in the face of destruction. It is strange for us, after Katorga, where we changed from crushed and isolated individuals into a powerful whole, to learn that these socialists, once an articulated whole, tried and proved in action, disintegrated and became helpless units. But in the last 2 decades, our life as social beings has steadily expanded, filled out. We are inhaling. Then it was just as steadily contracting, shrinking under pressure. We were exhaling, so that it is unseemly for your age to judge that other. There were, moreover, many different degrees of severity in the treatment of exiles, and this too disunited and weakened them. The intervals at which identity cards were exchanged varied. For some it was monthly, and the formalities were excruciatingly slow. Unless you didn't care about sinking to the lowest category, you had to observe the rules. The mildest form of banishment also survived until the beginning of the 30s. This was not exile, but free resistance, minus. In this case, the person penalized, the minusnik, the minusnik, was not told to live in one specified place, but allowed to choose any town, with certain exceptions or minuses. Once having chosen, he was tied to that place for the same 3-year period. The minusnik did not have to report regularly to the GPU, but did not have the right to leave the area. In years of widespread unemployment, labor exchanges would not give a minusnik work. If he tried to find himself a job, pressure was put on the management to dismiss him. The minus pinned the dangerous insect down, and it submissively waited its turn to be arrested properly. Then again, people still believed in a progressive order which could not and would not need to exile citizens, believed in an amnesty, especially as the splendid 10th anniversary of October drew near. The amnesty came, the amnesty struck. They started reducing terms of banishment by a quarter, 3-year sentences by 9 months, and that not for everyone. But since the great game of patience was being laid out, and the 3 years of exile were followed by 3 years in a political isolation prison, followed in turn by another 3 years in exile, this acceleration of the process by 3 months did not make life more beautiful. Then it would be time for the next trial. The anarchist Dmitry Venedictos was toward the end of his 3-year sentence. The anarchist toward the end of his 3-year exile in Tobolsk, 1937, was arrested, and the charge against him was categorical and precise, disseminating rumors about loans. What can they have meant by rumors when the loan comes around each year as infallibly as the flowers in May, and dissatisfaction with the Soviet regime? In exile, of course, should be content with his lot. And what happened to him next for this obscene crime? He was sentenced to be shot within 72 hours, and no right of appeal. His surviving daughter, Galina, had already made a brief appearance in the pages of this book. We have seen what exile meant in the first years of newly won freedom, and seen, too, the only way of escaping completely. Exile was a temporary pen to hold sheep marked for slaughter. Exiles in the first Soviet decades were not meant to settle, but to await their summons elsewhere. There were clever people, former people, and also some peasants who already realized in the 20s all that lay before them. And when they reached the end of their first 3-year term, they stayed exactly where they were. In Archangel, for instance, just in case. Sometimes this helped them not to be caught under the mid-comb again. This was what exile had become in our time, instead of the peace and quiet of a Shushenskaya or cocoa drinking in Turkmen. You will see, that we had heavier burdens than Ovid's homesickness to bear. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day.